I would like to introduce to you our speaker for today. Dr. Gary Lovett is a senior scientist at the Cary Institute of Ecosystem Studies in Millbrook, New York. He received a bachelor's degree in biology from Union College and a Ph.D. in biology from Dartmouth College. Gary's research focuses primarily on the effects of air pollution, climate change, and invasive insects and diseases on forests. He is the author of over 140 scientific publications, an editor of 2 books, and has been elected a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. He has recently led a team of scientists in an initiative to summarize the science and impacts of forest pests and link the science to policy solutions. Thank you so much for being here, Gary. I'll let you share your screen and take it away.
All right, well, let me share that screen. Well, thank you very much, Elizabeth, for the introduction. I'm really glad to be here. Can you hear me okay? Okay, good. Yeah, so as Elizabeth said, I'm going to talk about imported forest pests, or invasive forest pests that are coming from other countries by international trade. And in this talk, I'll talk a little bit about the background of the problem and the scope of the problem. I'll talk about some of the ecological and economic impacts of those pests. We'll talk about policy options for dealing with them, and then what we're doing right now. So I'll try to hit all those things. But as I get started, I wanted you to do one thing. If you have an invasive forest pest problem that's near you, just type in the chat box what state or province you are from and what the pest is. So that way I'll get a sense of where people are from and what kind of pest problems they're dealing with. So just type in the chat while I get going here. So we certainly have, I'm from upstate New York. The Institute of Ecosystem Studies is in, Cary Institute of Ecosystem Studies is in the Hudson Valley of New York State. I'm seeing these scrolling through. This is great EAB, lots of pest problems all over North Carolina, California, all right, Maryland. Yeah, okay, so I can see people are from all over the place and we have all sorts of pest problems. Everybody's got some. Let me, as that's scrolling through, thanks for doing that. Let me tell you about how I got interested in this issue. So I'm a forest ecologist, and I was for a long time studying the impacts of like air pollution and climate change on forests. And we had these long-term forest plots we were doing. I was doing a lot of work in the Catskill Mountains of southeastern New York State. You can see them circled in yellow here on this map of New York State. And we were looking at the impacts of particularly nitrogen deposition. We're doing long-term plot studies, but I was having a problem in that these long-term forest plots, which were single species plots of individual species, where the trees were dying in them. And they weren't dying of climate change and they weren't dying of air pollution. They were dying of invasive forest pests. So for instance, our hemlock plots were attacked by the hemlock woolly adelgid, a small insect that sucks the ray parenchyma cells in hemlock trees, and it was affecting the vigor of those trees. The oak forests were affected by the gypsy moth, an invasive lepidopter, and you can see that photo there. That's one of my crew standing there in an oak forest. That's mid-July, so you can see the way the gypsy moths have defoliated that forest. And the beech stands were affected by beech bark disease. That's a combination of an introduced insect and an introduced bark cankering fungus that slowly kills beech trees over the course of a couple decades and really changes the structure of the forest. So we had all these forest pest problems, and I kind of realized that if I want to really understand what's driving changes in this forest, I shouldn't necessarily be studying climate change and air pollution. I should be studying these forest pests, and that's when I got into that line of research. I'm looking at the chat, Michigan, Indiana, Intermountain region, bark beetles, blister rust, spruce budworm. a lot of bark beetles. I do want to point out that one thing that I am going to be talking about. So we have two kinds of invasive forest pest problems in North America. One is native pests that are expanding their range and expanding their outbreak frequency because of climate change. And that's what's going on with mountain pine beetle in the west. It's what's going on with southern pine beetle along the east coast. And we also have pests that are being introduced through international trade. That's what we're calling imported forest pests that are acting like an invasive. So once they arrive, they can start to expand their range and cause great damage. And I'm really going to be talking about the second one of these. I mean, from the tree's perspective, they probably don't care whether they're being eaten by a native pest or an invasive pest. But when it comes to the policy aspect, the policies are quite different for dealing with those two different kinds of pests. So let me move on here. This is not a new problem, as I think many of you know. Since the middle of the 1800s, we've been accumulating forest insect pests in the country, roughly at a rate of about 26 per decade or 2.6 per year. And that has not ceased at all. That's continued to go up. These data were from a paper published in 2010. It hasn't been updated since then, but there's been enough new pests introduced that I'm sure that line is constantly going up, or if the slope hasn't increased. This is the cumulative number of pests, by the way, versus year. The brown line here at the bottom of this graph is a subset of those insect pests, and that's the wood-boring insects. You can see that that was also going up at a steady rate, but around the 1980s, that slope increased. And that is considered largely to be due to the advent of increased containerized shipping. Because all those containers most of our goods that are transported by ship these days come in containers. And those containers often had wooden packaging material inside them, like pallets and crates and dunnage that keeps the load steady inside the containers. And that wood packing material can be infested with pests, and that's a way that we're bringing a lot of these wood-boring insects into the country. So the wood-boring, even though there's a constant increase in the number of insect pests, the wood-boring component of that is increasing. And of course, this isn't just a problem here in the eastern U.S. where I am, and that chat can definitely attest to that. You can see from all over the country, people have forest pest problems. In fact, pretty much anywhere there's a forest in the U.S., there's a forest pest problem. And this title says it's a serious problem in all 50 states. And those of you who are from Alaska or Hawaii will notice that I've only got 48 states drawn here. I noticed one of our listeners is from Hawaii, and I'm sorry to not have that on the map. But Hawaii certainly has its own forest pest problems with the rapid ohia death. Alaska has some problems also, but basically the problems with the numbers here are the number of imported pests per state. These are data from 2013, so the numbers are higher now. Like in New York, like we're #1 in New York. We have more forest pests than any other state. We're probably up to about 65 by now with new pests that have been introduced. The problem you can see, every state in the country has a problem with that, and Canadian provinces as well. But you can see the problem is worse in the Northeast, upper Midwest, and on the West Coast, particularly in California. So let's take a little tour and take a look at some of these pests. So up in the Cascades, also in the Rockies and Sierras, the white pine blister rust is affecting the forests of the white pine group. In particular, white bark pine, which is a foundational species for high elevation forests in those alpine mountain environments, has been severely affected by the white pine blister rust, an introduced disease. So in Northern California, there's a sudden oak death, which has been severely affecting oak and tan oak forests in that area. Southern California, the polyphagous shothole borer and its cousin, the Kuroshio shothole borer, affect over 100 genera of trees. Including avocado, so it's an agricultural pest. In the center of the country, the thousand cankers disease affects black walnut trees. In the southeast, the laurel wilt is affecting red bay and laurel trees throughout Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, and and I put that arrow about where Everglades National Park is. Those trees are a major component of Everglades National Park, so it's having a severe effect on that. That disease, that laurel wilt disease, has been estimated to have killed over 300 million trees so far. The spotted lanternfly is a newly introduced pest in Pennsylvania. That is, its main host is Ailanthus, which is an invasive tree. That sounds like good news, except its secondary hosts are things like apples and grapes and many hardwood trees. We don't know yet how lethal it is on those hardwood trees, but it's certainly a major pest of vineyards and orchards in Pennsylvania. Up along the New England coast, the winter moth is affecting many hardwood trees, including the oaks. Beech bark disease is, as I mentioned before, is a major pest of the northern hardwood forests in northern New York and northern New England. It is a combination of an insect and a bark cankering fungus that, as I said, causes the tree to deteriorate slowly over decades. But it's taken out all the large beech trees in our area. And of course, then there's emerald ash borer. That's the most destructive pest that we've introduced so far. It was first discovered in Michigan in 2002, but it's spread through, I think it's like 35 states now throughout the East, and it's moving into the West. So this has the potential of functionally eliminating the whole ash genus from North America. So very, very serious pest. So you look at that map and you could see there's problems everywhere, but it kind of gives you the sense that, well, maybe each area has one pest problem. So let's focus in on just one area and see what's happened over time. And I chose the Great Smoky Mountains National Park because I used to work there, and it's been an area that's been hit by wave after wave of imported forest pests. So here's a timeline for the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. In the 1930s, the chestnut blight came through and took out one of the dominant species throughout the Mid-Atlantic, but in the national park as well. In the 1950s, Dutch elm disease came through and killed the elms that were riparian species there. In the 1960s, woolly adelgid was introduced, and by the time I was working in the park in the 1980s, the balsam woolly adelgid had killed most of the high elevation Fraser fir in the park. So it looked like just a forest of dead fir up there. Beech bark disease came in the 80s and severely affected the beech gap forests along the high elevation ridges. Butternut canker disease also came in the 1980s. That's a very lethal disease for butternut trees. Dogwood anthracnose has killed a lot of the dogwood in the park, as it has in our area up here in the Northeast. It's a foliar fungal disease. Hemlock woolly adelgid came in the late 1990s, but in the 2000s, it spread throughout the park and has been killing those magnificent old growth hemlock stands in the park. Thousand cankers disease came in the 2010s. I think it was about 2012 or so that came in. That's the disease of black walnut. Hasn't spread too far as I know, but it certainly threatens those. And then emerald ash borer arrived in 2015, and that of course threatens all of the ash trees in the park. So you can see pest after pest. I mean, the question is, how much can one forest take of this kind of invasive pest impact? And what I'm sure the park managers are asking is, what's next? And there are lots of possibilities of what's next, unfortunately. Oak wilt is in the area. And that's a disease of oak trees that's quite lethal. Spotted lanternfly, I discussed in Pennsylvania, could spread south. And then there's Asian longhorn beetle. I wouldn't normally have put Asian longhorn beetle in there, except for recent events. So up until earlier this year, this map on the left would have been the map of outbreaks of Asian longhorn beetle in the US. You can see a number of them. This is a map produced by APHIS, I believe. The red areas where there's still active outbreaks, Worcester, Massachusetts, a couple around the New York area, southern Ohio and the Cincinnati area, there's a large outbreak. So what happens is they have an outbreak of this pest. This is something that's transferred by wood and packaging material. And the APHIS and the state rush in to try to quash the outbreak mainly by cutting trees. So I know in Worcester, for instance, they've cut over 30,000 trees out of the city of Worcester to try to control the outbreak there. And so this is a game of whack-a-mole, really, where this thing keeps popping up as an outbreak, and we go in and try to eradicate it. As of 2017, we had spent roughly $650 million on eradication efforts for this pest, but it keeps coming in. And I say that used to be the map. Now we have to add the southeastern U.S. to it, because just this May, there was a new outbreak located just outside of Charleston, South Carolina. They're still delineating the outbreak. They're trying to figure out how big it is, how long it's been there, but that promises to be a problem also. You can see this is a bug that's easy to spot. It's a big bug. This photo, by the way, is by David Coyle. He is the president of the board of NASMA, and he's also an entomologist and forest pest specialist at Clemson University in South Carolina. So he's been intimately involved in the reaction to this Asian longhorn beetle outbreak in South Carolina. Let's talk a bit about ecological impacts. Introduced pests, these kinds of introduced pests are the only threat to forest health that can reduce major canopy species to ecological insignificance in a matter of decades. And of course, the chestnut blight is a great example of that. That was a dominant tree species throughout the mid-Atlantic. You can see from this picture on the right, the size of the trees that chestnut could grow to. This is a picture from North Carolina, and I put that picture in just to give us a sense of what we can lose from these pests. But chestnut was an important timber species, but was also a very important wildlife species because of the production of chestnuts, and it was also very important to residents of the area where chestnuts live, because the chestnuts were also used in addition to timber, they were used for livestock feed. So these pests can almost eliminate an entire species. So this is what happened to chestnut in the last century, and this is what's happening right now to hemlock and to ash. And of course, when a tree dies, it's not just the tree itself that's the problem. That impact can reverberate throughout the ecosystem. And a great example is the hemlock woolly adelgid that I was telling you about before, because there has been quite a bit of research done on this. So the hemlock woolly adelgid is a tiny insect. You can see these little black spots here. They feed at the base of hemlock needles. And of course, a few of those wouldn't bother a hemlock, but when you have millions and millions of them on a tree, they basically suck the life out of the tree. And so these tiny bugs can kill a big tree. Hemlock in the eastern US is one of our dominant old growth species, grows to be very large, very old, creates a particular kind of forest. It's dark, it's cool, it's shady, it's a beautiful forest. If you haven't had an opportunity to visit an eastern hemlock forest, I recommend you try to do that before we lose them all. But anyway, so this hemlock woolly adelgid, which was introduced into Virginia probably in the early 1900s, really didn't get going until the 1980s, where it spread throughout the mid-Atlantic states, and it's now spreading up through New England, into Michigan and so forth. But anyway, this hemlock woolly adelgid causes the death of trees, of course, and that releases succession in the forest. These are hemlocks are a late successional species, but killing them releases the succession. So we get a total change in forest structure, forest composition, and it also can provide an entry point for invasive plants. And research in the Delaware Water Gap in Pennsylvania has shown how much of an impact that can be with invasive plants getting in. But other changes happen as well. There kind of course, hemlock is a unique species, so there's changes in carbon storage and nutrient retention when it dies. That's kind of what I study for a living, so I could go on for hours about that, but I won't for your sake. Certainly the change in forest structure from a coniferous forest to usually being replaced by a deciduous forest changes the bird species, causes decline of some bird species like this black-throated green warbler that I've shown a picture of here. There was one study in Connecticut showing a 93% decline in black-throated green warblers in the areas where hemlock declined. And of course, another aspect of hemlock is they often grow along streams. And so when they have a very dense canopy, so they cool the stream water and they provide a great habitat for cold water fish like this brook trout. So when the trees die, the canopy opens up, more light gets into the stream, it warms up the stream, and you reduce the habitat suitability for cold water fish like the brook trout here. So you could see that just this tiny bug getting into the forest not only kills the trees, it affects many different aspects of the ecosystem. And it may last for centuries. Some modeling work that we've been doing shows that, of course, you have the pest itself is likely to stay for a long time, millennia. So we may, for instance, not get hemlocks back for a long period of time. So that in itself is a long-term effect. But because individual tree species affect the quality of the soil, they change the carbon and nitrogen cycling in the soil, the actual physical properties of the soil. These things ramify for a long time throughout the ecosystem. So the impacts last for centuries. Let's talk just a little bit about the economics. There's been at least one study done on this that's more or less synthetic. This was done by Juliana Akama et al., published in 2011. So this is a forest pest problem. You might think that the largest economic impact would be on the forestry industry, but that's not what this study revealed. And so it was very interesting. It was kind of an eye-opener for me. So in fact, the timber owners are sort of a small fraction of the total cost of forest pests here. These bars show the total annual forest costs of insect pests. And the total is around 5 billion or so here per year for the country. But you can see that most of that cost is being borne by local governments and by homeowners, either through lost property values or the expenses they have for taking down trees. So that's the issue. So, this kind of makes sense when you think about it a bit. So if a tree dies in the forest, you lose the value of the tree. If a tree dies in a city or in someone's yard, you have to take that tree down because it's a safety issue, and the cost of tree takedown is quite expensive. And so it's really local governments and homeowners that are paying the bulk of the cost of this sort of epidemic of imported forest pests. And we know this is an underestimate of the true cost of imported pests because, for number one, the diseases are not included here. Things like beech bark disease or sudden oak death or oak wilt are not included in this tally. And also, this doesn't include any of the non-market values of trees. So the aesthetic, recreational, it doesn't even include things like the value of trees cleaning the air in the city or reducing runoff in the city. So there's a lot of things that are left out of this calculation. It was only the very most solid numbers that they could get they put into this. So I don't think this is the last word in economic impacts, but it does give you a sense of what the distribution of costs is and who's paying them. And when we talk about impacts in cities, we're not just talking about an economic cost. Certainly there is a large economic cost to cities that have to mobilize to take down trees along the streets and replant trees or treat trees if they decide to do that, treat them with insecticide. But there's also a quality of life issue, and I think these photos give you the sense of it as well as anything can. So the top photo is from Toledo, Ohio, showing a street with rows of ash trees that were later attacked by the emerald ash borer. So there's a before picture on the left and an after picture on the right, after the emerald ash borer came in and killed all those trees. And of course, all those trees had to be taken down. So the next picture in this sequence would have been just a row of stumps here where they took down those trees. The bottom picture is from Worcester, Massachusetts, where they had an outbreak of the Asian longhorn beetle. It's the same street in both pictures, the same place on the street. You can see it's lined with a row of maples there, a very attractive looking street. After they came through and took down all those trees, that's what it looked like. So you can imagine if you lived on one of these streets, it's really not just an economic issue. It's an issue of community quality of life and sort of community, the value you place in where you live. So it's worth thinking about that. So when I started thinking about this, I realized we had to do some sort of a synthesis of what these problems were, and a lot of the information that I've just presented to you came from this synthesis. So I'm thankful to a group of experts that we assembled to try to understand this problem and corral the information that was available. We published a paper on this in 2016 in Ecological Applications, and I'll give you a website at the end where you can get that paper if you want. This was an interdisciplinary teams of ecologists, entomologists, economists, and policy experts so examining the problem. And I want to shout out here for two colleagues that really helped me pull this together from a group called the Science Policy Exchange. The Science Policy Exchange is an organization that tries to move science, particularly environmental science, into the policy arena. And these people are very good at it. This is Kathy Fallon Lambert here. This is Marissa Weiss here, and they were integral to the development of this project. I also want to thank our funders on that project, which is the Northeastern States Research Cooperative, which is a program of the USDA, the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation, and the FM Kirby Foundation. So anyway, we did this synthesis with a group of scientists, and in the paper we listed these ecological impacts, we listed the economic impacts, and we also listed a number of policy options for dealing with this. But if you want to go beyond and actually make policy recommendations, you have to step beyond just a menu of options, and you have to say, these are the things that make the most sense to us. So some of us stepped beyond that paper and put out what we call a policy brief on this problem. And it gives some of the background, some of the graphics I've been using so far are in this publication, and also our list of recommendations, both in the general sense that I'll tell you about in a second, but also in a narrow sense of what agencies need to be doing what. And you can get that at this, you can download it at this website here. So let's talk a little bit about the policies. If we're going to make some recommendations, we need to say what our priorities are. And we have two main priorities here. One is we want to focus on prevention of importation and establishment rather than dealing with the pests after they're already here. So we just think it makes a lot more sense to try to keep them out of the country in the first place rather than trying to eradicate outbreaks that are already established or deal with the damage that's caused by the pests once they're no longer eradicable. The second priority is we want to focus on the pathways of introduction rather than focusing on individual pests. And we know for these forest pests what the two main pathways are. There are lots of ways that these pests get into the country, but there are two main ways that are responsible for the bulk of the pests, and those are the ones where we need to focus on. And the first one is solid wood packaging material like pallets and crates and dunnage. Dunnage is the material that's used to brace a load in a ship. The second major pathway is live woody plants that are imported for landscaping. The USDA calls them plants for planting. Those are the two main pathways we have to deal with. So there are regulations in place for both of those pathways. I want to talk just a little bit about why they are and why they're not adequate. So let's talk about the live plant imports first. So there's a list of plants that are not allowed to be imported, or if that need to have a pest risk assessment before they're imported. But for plants that are not on that list, let's call it a black list or a gray list. Plants that come in must have a certificate from the exporting country, a certificate of cleanliness, basically, and they have to pass through inspection in the US. So there are 17 plant inspection stations they have to pass through. They're run by APHIS, the branch of the USDA that deals with this. APHIS stands for the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service. APHIS not only does the inspections, they sort of set the rules by which these imports can take place. So here's a guy at a plant inspection station. The problem here is that the last tally that I saw, we import about 3 billion live plants a year into the country, and we have a total of about 65 inspectors. So I'm sure this guy does a great job. I'm not throwing shade on him, but you know, he's got to inspect like 43 million plants a year. It's never going to happen. So there's only a small fraction of the plants that are actually inspected. And even so, visual inspection is not an adequate way to find these pests. A lot of them are just not visible. The fungi or sometimes even the insects are hidden inside the plant, and they're not amenable to visual inspection. So as a result of a paper that was published in 2012, estimated this process is 28% efficient. So it actually gets 28% of the actual pests that are coming in on live plants. So that's not very good. And let's take a look at wood packaging material. There's also regulations on wood packaging material. There's an international treaty. The regulation is called ISPM 15. You may have heard of that. It says that the wood packaging material that's used in international shipments must be either heat treated to a certain level, or it must be fumigated with methyl bromide, and then it needs to be stamped to show that it was treated. So here's some wood pallets, and you can see the stamp on them. This is the ISPM 15 stamp that says that they were treated. There was a study published in 2014, though, that showed that this policy as a whole was only 36 to 52% effective at reducing the importation of pests in wood packaging material. So they looked at the rates of infestation of wood packaging material before these regulations were implemented in 2005, and then after these regulations were implemented after 2005. And they found a 36 to 52% drop in the number of infestations, the rate of infestation of this wood packing material. So, so that's helpful. It definitely helped, but still, half or less of the pests that are coming in wood packaging material were reduced by this policy. It certainly wasn't complete. A couple of other things that this paper by Bob Hack showed. One is that the infestation rate of wood packaging material is low, only about 0.1%. So only like 1 in 1,000 shipments that contains wood packaging material is infested with bugs. But there's so much material coming in. This port picture gives a sense of all these containers coming in that have wood packaging material inside them, that even at that low rate, it allows about 13,000 introductions of new wood-boring pests into the country every year. So that's 13,000 opportunities for new outbreaks of these wood-boring insects that come in wood packaging material. And a subsequent paper by Brian Leung from McGill showed that if you project that forward, you take that infestation rate and the projected rate of trade going forward, we could have a potential 3-fold increase in wood-boring pests by the year 2050. That's if you take all the wood-boring pests that are in the country right now, that includes the native ones and the introduced ones, we could have 3 times as many by 2050 because of this importation rate. As a forest ecologist, that is a really scary prospect. That could be catastrophic. So policies are in place, but in my view, they're currently not adequate to really solve the problem. So we suggested 5 actions that need to be taken in a package that we call Tree Smart Trade, and I'm going to go through them for you right now. What time is it? 2:34. Okay. The first is, I think, the most important one. We need to switch to pest-free packaging materials for international shipments to the U.S. That is the source. The wood packaging material is the source of the most destructive pests that are coming into the country right now. We need to minimize new pest outbreaks by expanding early detection and rapid response programs. So we need to be able to detect where these outbreaks are happening early if the pests get through our inspection process, and we need to be able to respond to eradicate them. We need to augment our international pest prevention programs with key trading partners. So this is working with our trading partners to make sure the material is pest-free before it leaves the port that it's being exported from. We need to restrict the importation of live plants in the same genera as native woody plants in the US. So those plants that are in the same genera as our native plants are the ones that are most likely to transmit pests to our native plants. So we should restrict the importation of those because they pose the biggest threat to our native plants. And lastly, we need to tighten enforcement of penalties for non-compliant shipments. So we need to ramp up the enforcement and the penalties that are assessed here for to at least make sure that the regulations that we already have in place are being enforced. And I'll talk a little bit about that later on. But first, I want to talk about the wood packaging issue because that has been the most controversial recommendation. So we recommended that we switch to pest-free packaging material, and by that we mean non-solid wood. And we recommend that it still be wood. It could use manufactured wood products like plywood and OSB and things like that. And you can make a pallet that does everything that a wood pallet does, but it would be slightly more expensive. So, but let's consider the humble pallet here. I'm sure you've all seen these. You've probably used them in the past, but you may not know that there's about 2 billion of these in circulation in the U.S. And probably 20% of those, 10 to 20%, are used for international shipment. The rest are being circulated domestically. Nobody knows exactly how many are in circulation in the rest of the world. There's just never been a tally of that. So all we know is the number for the US, but there's a lot. Pretty much everything you buy has been on a pallet at one point or another. And of those that are circulating, about over 90% of them are made of wood. So wood is by far the dominant material for pallets. There are some plastic pallets, there are some made of other materials, but wood is the key thing. So, eliminating solid wood packaging, and particularly pallets, would be a big shift for the economy. But you could imagine how that might be phased in over time. And there's some other considerations here. First of all, wood is cheap. It's fairly durable. It's recyclable, so it's a good product. I mean, it's what you would want to use if it didn't carry pests. And another thing is that pallets are an important market for low-grade forest products throughout the U.S. And if you talk to forest managers, they'll tell you that they need markets for the low-grade wood in order to stay viable as businesses. Some estimates show that as much as 40% of the hardwood production in the U.S. goes to pallets. That's 40%. That kind of blew me away when I heard that. And another consideration is that wood pallet producers have a national trade association, and their job is to make sure that more wood pallets are sold, not lower. And so they've been in opposition to a lot of the policies that we've proposed here. So we're working at present on better enforcement of the penalties for non-compliant wood packaging material. We get wood packaging material in all the time that is either not stamped, so you can't tell that it's been treated, or it's stamped and they inspect it and it still has pests in it. And we're also working with private companies on the best practices for keeping pests out of international shipments, the ways to choose the right packaging material and so forth. So the wood packaging, when we drill down on it like that, you can see that it's not just a simple solution. It's quite complex and it requires some careful thought. Okay. So we have had some recent successes here, and I would like to talk those up. So the Customs and Border Protection, I guess I could say maybe we can claim a little bit of credit for that, but other people are calling for it as well, for tightening their enforcement of wood packaging regulations. And they did that with a new policy that came in line about early 2018. And they are now more aggressively enforcing the wood packaging regulations. And believe me, shipping industries are beginning to take notice because they're getting handed some pretty hefty fines. If you're caught with infested wood packaging material, you can get a very large fine, and you also have your shipment turned around and sent home. So that can be quite expensive, both in terms of the actual cost of sending the ship back, but also in terms of the delay of the products that you're looking for importation. So the shipping industry is very interested in working with us to find the best way to keep these pests out of the wood packaging material. Another success has been a provision in the 2018 Farm Bill that requires USDA to do a comprehensive report on the issue and possible solutions to the problem. They're working on that now. We've been in touch with them. The report is due in March of 2021, so next March. And we're looking forward to that. I hope it's a sort of a clear-eyed view of the problem, and with a good look ahead at what can be done to try to strengthen our defenses against these forest pests. And lastly, we've just started a new initiative with USDA to develop voluntary measures that importers can use to minimize pests in wood packaging material. So this is working with shippers, working with retailers, and to discuss what the issues are, how they can best source wood packaging material that's reliably pest-free. And we're working with a group called the Sustainability Consortium on that effort, and it's been a good success so far. We're very, very pleased with that. So moving forward, what we're doing, we're advocating for stronger policies. We're trying to build a coalition of NGOs and scientists. So if any of you want to help out with this, please contact me, and we can talk about how you can best contribute. We're working, as I said, with international shippers to try to develop best management practices to keep these pests out of shipping. And we're working a lot on communication, both with Congress, with federal agencies, with the media, and with private companies, as I said. So communication is key. We need to raise the profile of this issue in order to get anything done. And so what can you do about this problem? Unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, but the fact of the matter is that a lot of this has to do with federal trade regulations. There are some things you can do personally. One is don't move firewood around. I'm sure you've all heard that. Firewood is one of the main ways that these wood-boring pests get moved from place to place, particularly the Asian longhorn beetle, the emerald ash borer. And that doesn't stop pests from getting into the country, but it does slow down their spread once they're already here. So don't move firewood. You can buy only native plants. I think you know that already. We don't want to encourage the importation of live plants from other countries. And one way to do that is to make sure there's not a market for them. And lastly, and I think this is most important, is speak up. We need, as I said, we need to raise the profile of the issue. And so contacting federal representatives and national environmental organizations to ask them to take action is something that would be key. That Congress certainly won't act on this until they have some pressure from voters to do that. There are some environmental organizations that are concerned about this and are taking action. The Nature Conservancy has a small program in it. American Forest has been interested in for a long time. This is Becky Turner. She's one of the vice presidents of American Forest. And she's been involved with us in trying to lobby for these changes in our policies. So I guess I'll finish on that note. Concerned citizens need to speak up about this issue. I mean, we as citizens, we're more and more demanding clean energy. We should be demanding clean trade as well. And so in order to make this happen, you need to talk it up when you talk to other people. You need to write to your congressman, write to the environmental organizations that you belong to, and say, this is a problem that matters to me. What are you doing about it? So if you want more information on this issue, you can go to this website, treesmarttrade.org. There's those brochures, the paper, so forth, are available for download there. You can follow us on Twitter at treesmarttrade, or you can just contact me at this email address. So that is all I wanted to say. I would be happy to, I'm going to stop sharing the screen here, and I would be happy to take questions for the rest of the time.
Okay, thank you so much, Gary. Can you hear me okay?
You're a little faint, so speak up as much as you can. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So we do have a number of questions that have popped up, and I am going to keep us on time, but we can cover quite a few of these. The first question, earlier in your presentation, you had a U.S. map that showed the number of species per state. Is there somewhere that attendees could get a list of what those species in each state are?
Yeah, the Forest Service has a website, and they've been working on that website, so I'm not sure what condition it is in right now, but they have a forest pest inventory website that had a mapping capability. You could click on your state and find out what's there. I don't have I can't put it in the chat, but if you Google this acronym, FHAAST, Forest Health something assessment team or something, FHAAST, you can get to those maps. So that would be the place to go.
Great, thank you so much. We had a question about the cause of, if you knew the cause of most of the dogwoods in Central Florida, and if that was related to some of the pests that you spoke about early in the presentation.
Was the question about dogwoods in Central Florida?
Yes, dogwoods in Central Florida. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I don't know Central Florida per se, but throughout the eastern U.S., dogwoods are affected by this disease called the dogwood anthracnose. It's a foliar fungus. It affects trees primarily when their leaves are moist. So if you have a moist spring, you'll have a worse case of it, or if you have trees that are growing in the shade. So a lot of the dogwoods in the southeastern U.S. are understory trees, and so they'll grow in the shade. That keeps their leaves moist longer. I know at our place in New York State, the Cary Institute has a forest. We've lost like 95% of our dogwoods to this disease, and the ones that are remaining are the ones that are out in the open, like along the roadsides. All the ones that are in the understory of the forest have died. That's probably the problem, but I can't tell for sure.
Thank you. You spoke about a decline in some bird species after forest pests are introduced. Can you speak if there are an increase in any native species? Are there any species that could be seen as a benefit?
Yes, there are, and that is a great question. I should have mentioned that. So anytime you have a change in forest species composition, you have some winners and losers in the bird community. For the hemlock woolly adelgid, those species that are in our area, hemlock often grows intermixed with hardwood species, broadleaf species. So those bird species that are associated more or like the habitat of the conifer hemlock are going to decline, and those species that prefer hardwood canopies are going to increase. And of course, when you have a lot of dead trees, woodpeckers are going to do really well for quite a long time. So in that particular study that showed the decline of the black-throated green warbler, I can't remember, you can look up the study. It was published, I think, in 2013, and the first author's name was Tingley, Tingley. And it was in Connecticut. But I do remember that one of the species that increased the most was cowbird. So I don't know if you know cowbirds, they're nest parasites. So if it's a trade-off between losing black-throated green warblers and increasing cowbirds, I know which way I'd go with that. But you're absolutely right. There are winners and losers on all these vegetation changes.
All right, thank you. Here's your next one.
Mm-hmm.
If I am a domestic shipper in the United States, what can I do to reduce the risk of moving pests in my packing materials?
Yeah, okay, that's a great question. So you're shipping domestically, okay? So it's not required that wood packaging material that's shipped domestically be treated by heat treatment or fumigation. That's only a requirement for international shipments. But if you want to be sure that you're not shipping these things around wood packaging material, what you could do is use treated pallets. Pretty much all pallet manufacturers make treated pallets, so they have a way of treating them. And in the US, I think that's a pretty reliable, that stamp saying it's a treated pallet, it's pretty reliable. So there's probably not much in the way of pests if you use those treated pallets. I think the problem with stuff coming in from abroad is that the material is stamped, but it hasn't really been treated or hasn't been treated well enough, and that's why there's still pests in it. But if you're shipping domestically, I think you could use treated pallets, and that would be a great thing to do. So good question.
Great, thank you. Along the same lines, and I'm sorry, I don't know specifically which slide this was referring to, but one of the slides talked about a 3 times increase in wood-boring forest pests.
Mm-hmm.
Does that mean that all non-native insects, including the ones that aren't considered pests, or just those that are considered invasive pests?
I'm trying to think back to the paper. That was a paper by Brian Leung et al. He was talking about all wood-boring insects. Okay, so those would be, and most of the wood-boring insects I think would be considered pests. Some of them are worse than others. Some of them are really devastating, like emerald ash borer and Asian longhorn beetle. Some of them not so much. So he was talking about a 3-fold increase in total number of wood-boring insects. And of those, some of them are likely to be very damaging pests. Probably most of them are not, but it only takes a few emerald ash borers to wreak havoc.
Yes. Okay. Is the compostable packaging, like the ones being made using mycelium, a good alternative, or would that also risk moving invasive species?
Ooh, that's a good question. I don't really know the answer to that. So compostable packaging. So it would probably, well, not knowing, I better not answer if I don't know too much about it. So I'm going to pass on that question.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Okay. And we still have a few more minutes. So thank you so much. This is great. We have a lot of great questions here.
Okay, good. Good.
If I buy wood chips from pallets made from a reputable landscape company, am I risking bringing forest pests on my property? And I think based on your earlier answer, that heat treated stamp might be the.
Yeah, but by the time it's chipped, you don't know. You don't know where it came from. So I would say, yes, you are risking chipping itself. Won't necessarily get rid of the pests. I mean, it's going to kill some of them, but you could bring some onto your property. So, I think chips made from pallets are probably a risk.
Well, and that gives me an opportunity to also let folks know that the NASMA Weed-Free Forage and Gravel Committee is expanding into a new mulch certification program. And that is a really exciting thing that's going to be coming very soon from NASMA. And so just stay tuned for that.
Great.
Okay, so here's a question. In Western New York State, we are getting a handle on some of the impacts from emerald ash borer. And now we are starting to see HWA. Sorry, I
Mhm.
don't know that acronym.
Hemlock woolly adelgid.
Thank you so much. Any idea how quickly the spotted lanternfly is spreading in from Pennsylvania, and when we need to be prepared for that? And then thank you. I enjoyed your seminar.
Well, it just so happens, there we go. So a map of spotted lanternfly. Oh, can you see that? Did I share the screen?
I can't see that.
Oh,
No.
yeah, I forgot to share the screen again. Well, I won't bother with it now. So the spotted lanternfly is actually expanding in range. Its range, it's the spotted lanternfly. Its main range is in eastern Pennsylvania. It's been expanding pretty rapidly, and individuals of spotted lanternfly have been picked up all around in New York State, Delaware, Virginia. Uh, the and so I think it's quite likely that the spotted lanternfly will have outbreaks of spotted lanternfly, I guess, within a few years throughout Western New York, Eastern New York, all the states that border Pennsylvania. I mean, I don't know for sure, but just given the way that the thing is spreading, the thing with spotted lanternfly is they can lay their eggs on just about anything, including trucks and train cars. So they can disperse pretty readily. In where I live in the Hudson Valley, two of our major crops are apples and grapes, and those are two of the major victims of spotted lanternfly. I should also mention in Western New York, I took this slide out, but there's also a new disease called the beech leaf disease. It's in Ohio, Pennsylvania, all along Lake Erie. And it's just jumped so that we now see it along Long Island Sound in Connecticut and New York. It's a foliar disease. We don't know what the cause is. I know Enrico Bonello is on the webinar here, and he's been doing research on that. He said at one point that it certainly is, it seems to be associated with a foliar nematode, but it may be that nematode is carrying microorganisms. We don't know. So that's an active area of research by forest pathologists. Could be, I mean, beech doesn't need any more problems. We've already got beech bark disease, and now it looks like we have a beech leaf disease to deal with.
Okay, thank you. Okay, here's a question. Recognizing that local governments and homeowners bear a disproportionate amount of the economic costs associated with forest pests, to what extent are local governments and homeowners being engaged in trying to address the issue?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have really tried to engage local governments. Just homeowners, that's such a diffuse thing that's really hard to engage them. But I have tried to engage local governments by talking to local officials, but also talking to the National League of Cities and the Council of Mayors. And they're kind of interested in this, but you talk to a mayor, and yeah, pests are a big problem, but there's also crime and garbage collection and all this, the budget and all this sort of stuff. So it's like it's a little hard to get their attention, even though they are the key victims for that. If we could get municipal organizations, particularly National League of Cities and the Conference of Mayors, engaged on this, that's quite a bit of political clout. I would love to be able to do that. We've had some buy-in from the National League of Cities. It hasn't been a major policy issue for them yet. I'm hoping.
Okay, and there was a similar question about state legislation and actually some comments about what Hawaii is trying to do as well. But in terms of working at this at the federal level, but also are there, that you're aware of, efforts being coordinated at the state legislative level to address this issue in parallel with the federal efforts?
Not that I'm aware of. So the states, there's not a whole lot they can do by themselves. They can stop the spread, or they can, deal with the spread into the state from neighboring states. And they do a lot of that. They can help cities cope with it, and they do a lot of that. But the issues of keeping the pests out, which is what I'm focused on here, keeping them out of the country, are really federal issues. And it doesn't matter which state they come into, those pests are for the most part going to spread throughout the range of their host tree. So in my area, we have emerald ash borer that was introduced into Michigan, and we have beech bark disease that was introduced into Nova Scotia. And so, you know, it doesn't matter where they land initially. So the idea is to keep them off the continent altogether. And so what states can do, I think, is pressure their federal delegations to take this up. And that's what I would like, particularly New York State, to do, because in New York State, as I showed you, we're the hardest hit state. So I would really love the leaders of New York State to take this issue to the federal level, and that they can do.
Okay. All right, so last question for you before we conclude here. We've largely recognized that moving firewood spreads forest pests. And you've spoken about a number of different wood products. Are the risks the same, or you know, how big is the risk amongst these other types of products?
For moving price internally in the country, I think that's what they're talking about. I don't know if I can speak to the relative risk. I would think that fire would be the highest risk because it's totally unprocessed wood, and you wouldn't notice an emerald ash borer in your ash log unless you're really looking for it. So I imagine firewood is the highest risk, but you know, as compared to like moving lumber or something like that, which has generally been dried and it doesn't have pests in it. There are other categories of things. I don't know, landscaping timbers and things like that may also be a threat. I don't know the relative risk of those.
Okay, thank you. Well, this has been an outstanding webinar. We are so appreciative of you for being here and sharing